She burns over 25% of her body. When we were both finally allowed to go home, as you can imagine, when third degree burns her over 25% of her body, she couldn't hold me. She couldn't nurse me. Something that I learned is the most important time, well, the strongest connection known is a connection between a mother and their child. That connection is built within those first 2 years of her life. Because my mom couldn't hold me, because she couldn't nurse me, we didn't have that opportunity. The other part of that is she was on heavy pain medication to help her deal with her pain. So because of that, when she took that medication, she really couldn't watch me. So I bounced around a lot. I'd stay with my mom, I'd go stay with my grandmother for a little bit, I'd come to the neighbor's house, an aunt's house, a friend's house, and then back to my mom's house. I did that for the first 3 years. I was 3 years old, I was back at my mom's house, I got into her purse, and I found that medication bottle. Now, at that time, medication, you could just pop the top open just like a pack of Tic Tacs. Now they have the safety, you got those sheet pro and all this other stuff to get it off, right? But then you just took the top off. So at 3 years old, I took that top off and I swallowed everything in that bottle. Went to the hospital, my heart stopped, and I went into a coma. Now, even though I survived, the state of California determined that my mom was to blame. So they removed me from the household. I was made a ward of the state. I was placed in a foster home. Shortly after I arrived to that foster home, my foster mom, her name was Miss Alexander, she began to lock me inside the closet. She'd open that closet door, she'd kick me, she'd hit me with a stick or a strap. It was while I was in that foster home, I was there for 6 years, while I was in that foster home, that I was sexually abused for the first time in my life. Now, you should think that that's got to be the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to share with you the worst thing that Mrs. Alexander would do to me is she would open that closet door. And she would stand over me and she would look at me and she would say, "You're stupid and you ain't going to never amount to nothing." That hurt me more than physical pain because for years and years, I believed that I was stupid. I believed that I would never amount to nothing. Just like she said. Mrs. Ski didn't know any of those things. Mrs. Ski didn't know that when she looked at me and she said, "I believe college prep history would be too difficult for you." Mrs. Ski didn't know that when she looked at me and she said, "You know, not everyone's cut out for college." It wasn't her voice that I heard. It was Miss Ski's voice. I'm sorry, it was the voice of my foster mom, Mrs. Alexander. She was telling me that I was stupid. She was telling me that I would never amount to nothing. I remained in that foster home again for 6 years. I got out when I was 9 years old. I didn't know it, but while I was in that foster home, my grandmother, she was in her 70s, she was going back and forth to court, trying to prove that she could take care of me in her old age. So she had to prove that she could take care of me. I'm going to tell you again something about my grandma. I shared it earlier. First, the court system told her no. But we know what she had in that bag. That Mufasa up in there. But finally, they granted her full custody of me. And I'll never forget the day she came to pick me up. She had this big old green long Oldsmobile, had suicide doors on it. It's the ugliest car I ever seen. It didn't turn corners, it turned like this all the way. Now my grandma, she had glaucoma. She wore these thick glasses. She coming up the road, all I saw was thick glasses. That come grandma. Right? She wasn't supposed to be driving, but there she was, looking at the distance, coming to get her grandbaby. But she stopped in front of that my foster mom's house. I was standing there with the little bag that my foster mom had packed. My grandmother got out, and I remember she had on her Sunday best clothes. Clothes that I know she used to wear only on Sunday. Nice dress, big old floppy hat with a flower right there in the middle. I ran off that porch. I left that little bag Miss Alexander that pack. I jumped into my grandmother's arms. I remember her squeezing me, saying, "Everything's gonna be okay." We got in that big old hoopty, no seatbelt. She turned the corners, I'm falling over. But we got to her house, and everything, just like she promised, everything was okay for a couple years. I Found out my mom was going back and forth to court now, trying to prove that she was better, trying to prove that she could take care of me. And because I wasn't allowed to spend time with my mom alone, just with my mom. So because of that, my mom rented a house behind that house I showed you earlier. So after school, even though I wasn't supposed to go to my mom's house, the school was right across the street, I jumped the fence. And I'd run home, but I didn't go home to my grandma's house. Guess where I went? To my mama's house. That's right. I go to my mom's house and we sit down and talk and have conversations, and she'd make me something to eat. But I remember talking and saying, Mama, you know, when I get big, I'm going to buy you a nice car. Not like grandma's. I said, I'm going to buy you a big old house with a fireplace, because, you know, we used to do that fireplace. And I had all these hopes and dreams, things that we were going to do. I was 11 years old, sleep on my grandmother's floor. That's where we slept oftentimes, because there were a lot of shooters. I was asleep on that floor. We got a knock on the door. It was my mom's roommate. Boom, 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 boom. We had a security screen door, metal, so it echoed throughout the house. My mom's roommate was screaming. She said, Miss Howe, that's what my grandma said, Miss Howe, come quick. It's Ruth. Ruth was my mom. She said, Miss Howe, come quick. It's Ruth. I can't wake her up. And that's where she said, I remember them now like they happened yesterday. She says, I can't wake her up. I believe she's dead. And that's how I found out that all of those hopes and dreams that I had with my mom were never going to happen. At that point, I became a very angry young man. Didn't care. Didn't care if I lived or died. Started breaking into houses, hanging out with all of the wrong people. And 3 years after the conversation I had with Mrs. Ski, 3 years after that, I was standing in front of a judge. Hands were handcuffed together. I had a belly band around my waist. Those handcuffs were connected to that belly band. I had handcuffs around each ankle with just about a 12-inch chain connecting both of my ankles together. And when I go to schools, I like to watch how young people walk now. You know, some of them be walking, they, you know, like, yeah, I'm going to class. Some be having their skinny pants on, so they got be scooting to class. But when I walked into the courtroom, I couldn't do any of those walks because of that chain. So it was more of a shuffle. But I stood in front of the judge, and the judge looked at me and said, the state of California sentences you to 15 years in prison. I'll never forget that night when the prison door closed behind me for the first time. My knees got weak, started shaking uncontrollably, and I collapsed. I fell to the floor alone. It was a cold concrete floor, and I cried. Only a couple of times that I could ever remember crying. I can remember lying there, hearing all the voices, the voice of my foster mom saying, you're stupid, you ain't gonna never amount to nothing. I remember hearing the voice of family that would tell me, you're gonna be just like your father. My father, career criminal, died in prison. I remember laying there thinking, you know what, they were right about me. And I decided, in my heart, I felt as though I was gonna die in prison. But then I met Mr. Lyles, the teacher that saved my life. Mr. Lyles was 6'3", he was an ex-Marine. He had a smile like every single day was Christmas. But he carried himself in a way like some of the deans I work with. I see them walking like, boy, I will throat chop you. Better not be cutting up today, right? Very soft-mannered man. For whatever reason, he saw something in me. From day one, he began to kind of mentor me, talk to me, and give me advice. My first year in prison, I spent over 6 months in solitary confinement. Many of you may have seen that show with those bad kids on it, where they say, scared straight. You may have seen some of those doors, they have another door in them. When I was in solitary confinement, Mr. Lyles, that teacher, would come down to my cell and he would open up that little door. He'd peek in through my cell, and I'd be sitting there with my back to him, but I knew he had that big goofy smile on his face. Mr. Humphrey, what you doing in there? And he'd say all this positive stuff to me, and I'd pretend like I wasn't hearing. I'd ignore him. By like sometimes my kids do. But he'd say all of this stuff every time I get in trouble. Last time I got in trouble, I was sent to solitary confinement. I was sent to solitary confinement for fighting. My face was busted up pretty good. Mr. Lyles came down to my cell. And this time, instead of opening up that little door, he asked the CO, the correctional officer, to open the door for him. He came into my cell. Again, I had my back to him. At that time, we had a strong connection. But he stood there and he looked at me. He said, Mr. Humphrey, he said a lot of things that to this day I don't remember. But what I do remember him saying is this. He said, Mr. Humphrey, he said, you can get out of prison and you can do great things with your life. He said, prison doesn't happen. He started to walk away to leave my cell, and he stopped one last time. He turned back around, he looked at me and said, Mr. Humphrey, he said, I believe in you. If he had continued to stand there, he would have seen the tears running down my face because no one had ever said that to me. I had never heard those words before. He walked out of that cell, he closed the door. I can remember thinking, Mr. Lyles believes in me. I started repeating his words to myself. Before long, his words became my words, and I started to believe in myself. A little over 4 years after the day I collapsed and fell on that prison floor, I stood in front of a parole board here. He said, Mr. Humphrey, why should we let you out? I said, I'm going to do great things. I got big plans. I laid out all of the things that I planned on doing once I got out of prison. They approved my parole. First day I got out of prison, I went straight to IHOP. Sack of pancakes, you think do great things on an empty stomach. But years later, working with young people, doing the things that I said I was going to do, I was thinking about Mr. Lyles. And I used to tell people that Mr. Lyles changed my life because he told me he believed in me. But today I know that's not true. He changed my life because of the connection that we had. My life changed not because of the words that were spoken, but because of the connection I had with the person that said it. And that's the second step in the action. It's creating a connection. Connections are key.